Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. It was the first hospital to have an ambulance corps, a maternity ward, an on-site medical school. It was on the front lines in the fight against devastating epidemics of yellow fever, cholera, and typhus, and against the scourge of AIDS and even Ebola. And yet it's best known as a destination for people who are insane. My guest is the historian David Oshinsky, who's a professor of history and medicine at NYU. He's a Pulitzer-Prize winner and author of a wonderful new book, Bellevue, 3 Centuries of Medicine and Mayhem at America's Most Storied Hospital. Professor Oshinsky, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. Thank you for coming in. Appreciate it. So this is essentially, it's a terrific book, by the way. I mean, I really enjoyed reading it. It's essentially a biography of a hospital. What drew you to this project?
Well, I am a New Yorker. I was a baby boomer, and when I came of age, if I was acting a little oddly, my mother would say, "Keep it up, David, you're on your way to Bellevue."
Uh-oh.
Bellevue really had that mystique about it. But what I also came to understand about Bellevue very early on as a New Yorker is if a cop is shot, a fireman is overcome with smoke, a worker falls off a scaffold, a homeless person is lying in the street. Bellevue is the destination. It has the greatest emergency services in the country. If the president were to take sick here, he'd go to Bellevue, or the Pope, or UN diplomats. So I began to get a sense that this was simply more than a mental hospital, although it did have very large mental facilities.
Right. The earliest days of Bellevue, which I guess goes all the way back to, was it the early 19th century?
It was earlier than that. It was actually the 1730s.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
All right. So the practice of medicine, which I learned from your book, was extremely primitive, maybe
Yes.
even more primitive than I had thought.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about what medicine was like in the early days of Bellevue.
Well, in the early days, in the 1730s, it was believed that miasmas or bad air, big clouds of bad air floated above, and they were the cause of most diseases, and they sort of penetrated the body and caused an imbalance of your bodily fluids. And most physicians believed that you either bled or purged the person in order to get rid of these bad, what were called bad humors.
Right.
And it was very, very popular. I mean, George Washington, who had a bad throat after he left the presidency, he was 67 years old, was essentially bled and purged to death. So that was medicine, and you know there was no anesthesia, there was no antiseptic medicine. So if you got a cannonball that hit your leg, basically they would take you in, 3 guys would hold you down, they'd put something in your mouth to muffle your screams, and in 9 or 10 seconds your leg was off.
And no sense when treating these horrible injuries or disease or whatever, that sanitation was so important.
None whatsoever.
Washing your hands. So
None whatsoever. You would have a surgeon, he'd get off his horse, hand it to someone, walk into the operating room, wouldn't put on a smock, wouldn't wash his hands, and he'd operate. And the interesting thing, Bob, is that at Bellevue, until after the Civil War, your chances of surviving an operation were so-so. But post-operative infection would set in more than half the time.
Wow.
So those who survived an operation were about 50% likely not to survive the next month.
Nevertheless, physicians and the aides at Bellevue had to fight some of the most horrendous epidemics that we can imagine. So I mentioned, yellow fever and cholera and typhus. I mean, so how did that go? How did that work out?
Actually, they did the best they could. You were dealing with, say, yellow fever. No one knew what the vector was, that it was an insect.
Right.
So they had no idea, how to solve this problem. They would try to make you as comfortable as they could. And what was always, I thought, really interesting about Bellevue was that the physicians who were there might not have known what caused the disease. And they were always trying different measures to try to figure them out, but they were always compassionate to the patient. The first Bellevue physician was a young man named Alexander Anderson. And Bellevue had just been formed basically as a way to quarantine yellow fever victims. Alexander Anderson was 23 years old, and he came to Bellevue to deal with these yellow fever victims. During that epidemic, his son died, his wife died, his mother, then his father, then his brother. He lost his entire family, and yet he stayed the course. He stayed there compassionately trying to take care of the victims of this disease. And I see him as kind of the first real physician at Bellevue. He didn't really know what to do at this time to help these patients other than to treat them with kindness, compassion, make sure they were comfortable. And that's kind of part of the Bellevue message.
Bellevue was a critically important center for care during the Civil War.
It was.
So many of the troops were evacuated from some of the most famous battlefields in American history, to tell you the truth, and they were brought to Bellevue. I assume some came on ships up the East Coast or something like that. Talk about that a little bit and talk about why they were coming to Bellevue.
Well, Bellevue had, I think, a nucleus of the greatest surgeons in the United States. They liked to come to Bellevue for all kinds of reasons. It was in a big city. They had uncomplaining bodies to experiment on, to be perfectly honest with you. And they believed it was their Christian duty to help the poor. You get all of these things together. They really have a tremendous surgical corps. So those who did not actually join the war effort stayed behind, and the troops would come to Bellevue. And to me, what was most extraordinary is that Bellevue at one time was treating both the Civil War veterans who were badly hurt in these battles, including Gettysburg, and at the same time they were treating anti-draft rioters in the next wards who were tearing basically New York City apart because they did not want to be drafted.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, these draft riots, which happened during the Civil War. Talk about what they were and Bellevue's role there.
Sure. When the war started, Bob, both sides believed it was going to last for a month. I mean, they were going to, once the North was going to win immediately, the South. Right. So there was no sense of really preparing in the long run for this war. And once Fort Sumter was attacked, the northern recruiting stations were overrun with people who wanted to volunteer. Then suddenly the war began to drag out. It was a real war with a lot of killing and a lot of deaths. And suddenly recruiting tailed off. So in 1863, the U.S. government decided that basically it had to start drafting young men, or men of ages of 20 to 40, into service. But there were all kinds of outs. If you paid $300 because the Union Army needed money, you would get out of the war. If you got someone to take your place, you hired a substitute. Teddy Roosevelt's father hired a substitute. J.P. Morgan hired a substitute. You basically could get out of the fighting. So more and more, the working classes of New York began to see this as kind of a poor man's fight and a rich man's war.
I'm so surprised.
Yeah, right, given our history. But on the other hand, they were right in the sense that huge fortunes were being made in New York City.
Right.
And there was a tremendous display of personal wealth. And at the same time, people were buying their way out of service. And to be perfectly honest as well, this was largely an Irish-American riot. I mean, you have to understand that it was. These were Irish-American working men.
So these were immigrants?
They were mostly immigrants. Yeah. Some of them had gotten citizenry, but many of them were still immigrants. And they believed that their jobs were in jeopardy because Lincoln was just on the verge of the Emancipation Proclamation coming into effect. And what these Irish American workers believed is that slaves would come up from the South, now free, take their jobs, take their neighborhoods, and the like. So not only were they being drafted into a war that the rich were getting out of, but they were fighting, they believed, for things that were not going to help them in the long run. And the end result was this enormous riot to try to stop the draft process, in which hundreds of New Yorkers were killed, large parts of Manhattan were burned to the ground, and it didn't really end till troops from Gettysburg and elsewhere were brought back into the city and simply opened fire on these rioters.
Wow. I think of Bellevue today as it's such an enormous complex. I think of it as almost like a small city. Can you give us a sense of sort of the size and the scope of the hospital?
Yeah, it is an enormous hospital. It's the flagship public hospital of New York City, the oldest public hospital in the country, and it's got a huge psychiatric section to it. It's really a remarkable place in that everybody gets treated. So the homeless get treated, people with who need emergency care immediately get treated. If you have drug-resistant tuberculosis, you get treated. Bellevue actually has a prison ward. The entire 19th floor of Bellevue is for male prisoners from Rikers Island who have medical or psychiatric issues. Right. So this is a very unusual hospital. It's not your typical middle-class hospital. It's always been a hospital of immigrants, of the poor, and those in need of immediate emergency care.
Now, in this modern era, Bellevue has had to fight some astounding crises, actually. Mm-hmm. So let's start with AIDS. There's a number, we'll see how many we can get to, but let's start with the AIDS crisis. Talk about when that broke here in the city, mm-hmm. and what Bellevue's role was.
Well, that's a good question. AIDS, as you know, hits the United States and urban areas, and particularly New York City and San Francisco, very hard. And it comes as a disease. No one knows what causes it. The only thing they know is that the people who have it are going to die. Bellevue begins to take in large numbers of gay men, particularly from Greenwich Village and the surrounding area. But Bellevue also has always taken in, for example, people who have drug problems. And what happened very early on, Bob, was that not only are we talking about gay men, we're talking about drug abusers who are getting it through needles. So Bellevue, within a very short period of time, is treating more AIDS patients than any hospital in the United States and perhaps in the world. Right. And more AIDS patients die at Bellevue than at any hospital in the United States. But the battle that is being fought on the front lines by nurses, technicians, administrators, physicians, to try to save these people and to try to figure out what is wrong with them and how can we protect ourselves while we are treating them, becomes an enormous issue. And what is also very important is that many of the experiments in finding the multi-drug cocktail that finally turned AIDS into not a death sentence, but a manageable condition, mm-hmm. were carried out at Bellevue. So Bellevue's role is enormous.
Prior to the AIDS crisis, Bellevue was hammered by deinstitutionalization.
It was.
Can you talk about
that? I can. As you know, as a first-rate reporter in New York City at this time, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a movement to kind of take people from mental institutions in New York State and to deinstitutionalize them, to move them into group homes and smaller facilities in their own neighborhoods where they could be taken care of, they'd be closer to family. What happens, of course, is that most of these neighborhoods do not want these places, to put it mildly. It becomes much harder to keep an eye on these people in terms of taking medication and the like. And what you find out is that an enormous percentage of them very, very quickly become homeless. The homeless population grows astronomically in New York City. Some of it is economic, but some of it really has to do with the deinstitutionalization of mental patients. And Bellevue is kind of ground zero because we have the largest psychiatric facility in New York City. And then, as you know, that psychiatric facility is kind of abandoned. The patients are moved to the new Bellevue Tower, and that gigantic building a block away from Bellevue becomes the largest men's homeless shelter in New York City. So the homeless are literally right next to the hospital now.
So we have the population of Bellevue to start with, the mentally ill population. You have deinstitutionalization.
Right.
You have the problem of alcoholism that's going to exist in a big city in any event, under any circumstances. And of course, New York, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, was going through a terrible crime problem. I mean, crime was spiraling out of control. And one of the most dramatic occurrences in your book was the story of Catherine Hinnant.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Catherine Hinnant was a young pregnant pathologist with a brilliant career ahead of her. And she's working at NYU Bellevue. She had an office on the pathology floor in Bellevue. She was raped and sodomized and murdered by a homeless man who was actually living in Bellevue. He had taken a room on the 22nd floor in the machinery room. He had stolen scrubs, he had a stolen ID badge, he had a stolen stethoscope around his neck, and he was walking through the hospital as if he were a physician. He came across Catherine Hinnant's office. She was preparing a lecture. It was a weekend.
Right.
The pathology wing was pretty well abandoned, and the crime took place. The homeless man was caught very, very quickly at another homeless shelter. But the sense was that Bellevue really had to make a decision now. And by that I mean Bellevue had always been extraordinarily kind and compassionate in dealing with the homeless.
Right.
They would provide food, and they would provide clothing, and they would provide meals. But on the other hand, the homeless living a block away in this huge shelter had begun to use the public facilities at Bellevue as sort of an extension of the shelter. They were stealing food off the plates of patients on upper floors. They were wandering around. They were causing problems. And Bellevue, particularly after the Hinnant murder, had to decide in very blunt terms, are we a hospital or are we a bus station?
Right.
In other words, there really is a line. We will always treat the homeless who have a medical issue that needs to be treated, but perhaps having our public facilities taken over by many homeless people who do not have medical issues is something we really have to deal with. So security was ramped up, and I think serious decisions were made that this dichotomy had to be real, it had to be focused, and you had to carry through with it, and we have done that since.
September 11th, 2001. Bellevue had actually prepared for some sort of an enormous crisis, the kind of thing that they thought was occurring on September 11th. Tell us from the perspective of the hospital what happened.
Well, from Bellevue, you could actually see, if you're on a high floor, you could see the two planes hit the towers. Bellevue knew this was going to be one of the busiest times ever. At the very end of World War II, a military plane had hit the Empire State Building, and a number of people had been killed. They all went to Bellevue.
Right.
Bellevue was expecting the same. The problem was, as you well know, during 9/11, there were kind of three stages. There were the people who were in the building and were incinerated instantly.
Right.
There were the people who escaped the building with very, very few medical problems other than, say, lung problems, covered with dust, and made it out alive. But there wasn't that middle ground. There weren't people with severed arms, gigantic injuries. There were a few, and they were treated at Bellevue. But what you had were hundreds of doctors, called in from everywhere, waiting there in lines, lines of scrubs.
Right.
Interns were there, nurses were there. People who had left one shift decided, I am staying, and nobody came. What I will say is that since Bellevue had been ground zero for so many previous disasters, the largest wall of prayer was outside the hospital. It stretched for blocks along a fence. And what that meant was, you know him so well, have you seen my daddy?
All those photos, they started going up instantly. Photos of people who were missing, people who had, most of them people who had been in the Trade Center and who were lost. And it was horrible. Have you seen my daddy, my sister, my wife, my mom, my dad?
And the other thing is that the medical examiner's office is right next to Bellevue. So all of the DNA testing, all of the body parts, whatever was left, came from there. And you could, from Bellevue, you could see the tents that had been set up to try to identify the dead. And that is still going on.
Wow.
Yeah.
Talk about Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah.
And what it's still a little hard to believe because people did not anticipate the disaster, the catastrophe actually that Sandy became, even right up until the time when it was actually hitting the city. But talk about what happened.
Well, 2012, this was either the biggest or the second biggest storm by volume ever in the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
And it hit on a full moon. And you know, New York City has a harbor and two rivers, and they're kind of narrow at the beginning, and there was a storm surge, the likes of which had never been seen in New York City.
Had not been seen and was not anticipated.
Was not. I mean, a storm surge was anticipated, Bob, but I mean 6 feet, not 15 feet.
Right.
It was crazy. Bellevue always sheltered in place. That was Bellevue's job. It sheltered in place, meaning it did not close. The VA closed, and Tisch Hospital next to Bellevue stayed open but closed after a day. Bellevue had its basement completely flooded, which meant that all of the fuel pumps were out, wall oxygen was out, supplies were out, and you had this toxic mess from pouring in from the East River. All the elevator banks were out. So Bellevue is now a hospital with virtually no electricity, no air conditioning, no lights, and here it was sheltering at least 800 patients in place. And it was a remarkably heroic effort. You had to have a bucket brigade. The National Guard brought in fuel, and it had to be moved 13 floors, step by step, hand by hand, by doctors, nurses, workers, so that the one working emergency generator on the 13th floor could provide a minimum of care to keep the most vital parts of the hospital going. But within a short period of time, we were running out of water, the toilets clogged, the air was fetid, patients were wondering, am I going to get out alive? Doctors were working endless shifts to try to keep the hospital going. Every single patient who needed oxygen had 2 residents by his side, making sure that if need be, they would do it, literally they would do it by hand. And then finally the order came down, it is safer to get them out than to keep them in.
Evacuate the patient.
Yeah, and the one thing you have to understand, Bob, is that evacuating a hospital, you're taking patients away from a safe environment generally, and you're moving them elsewhere, and that's dangerous. So they waited till the last minute, and then when the hospital simply could not function anymore, the largest vertical evacuation in the history of hospitals began. Prisoners dolly chained together, surrounded by corrections officers, going down step by step in orange jumpsuits. Men with drug-resistant TB being taken out, infants on respirators being taken out, psychiatric patients who had no idea what was going on being taken down the stairs. Right. It was a spectacularly heroic evacuation. Everybody got out.
Safe.
Everybody got out
No
safely.
one lost a life.
No one.
One of Bellevue's finest moments.
It was.
We've run out of time. Much to my chagrin, the book is fabulous. It's called Bellevue, 3 Centuries of Medicine and Mayhem at America's Most Storied Hospital. David Oshinsky, thank you so much.
My pleasure, thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. In this era of twits and tweets and ever-decreasing attention spans, Major League Baseball wants to shorten its games. One suggestion is that for bases on balls, there would be no need to toss 4 pitches outside the strike zone. The batter would just be placed on first base automatically. Another, and much worse idea, has to do with extra inning games. Each inning from the 10th on would start with a runner on second base and nobody out. That, of course, would make it much easier for teams to score and thus ties would be broken more easily. It would also be a radical break with baseball tradition. Purists are appalled, seeing this as nothing less than a perversion of the national pastime. What's the big deal? Well, for me, it's another reminder that we can't seem to live in the moment and just enjoy things anymore. We can't seem to just sit back and relax. We're always on, always in a hurry. We text while we're driving, and some of us seem to tweet all the time. We post photos of ourselves at ball games, concerts, and Broadway shows. It's as if something terrible might happen if we were to waste even a moment. 4 deliberate outside pitches to a batter might cast us into a veritable cauldron of boredom. I remember when my parents took me to my first Major League game. It was at the Polo Grounds, the home of the old New York Giants with the fabulous Willie Mays in center field. I was mesmerized by everything: the pitcher's wind-up, runners dancing off one base or another, relief pitchers warming up in the bullpen. I didn't want the game to ever end. But this is the 21st century, not the 20th. If you're at a ball game now, you have to worry about beating the traffic on the way home. Thousands of fans leave before the game is even over. Almost nothing is done at a leisurely pace anymore, and many of our most civilized and charming traditions have gone by the boards, which is a shame. That's all for now. See you next time.